Dog barks for hours in front of locked garage. You won't believe what happened. It was an otherwise ordinary morning in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Cedar Hollow. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges, and the soft hum of sprinklers echoed in the early light. However, an unusual sound broke the serenity, a persistent barking that didn't seem to stop. Neighbors peeked out their windows, curious and mildly annoyed. The source of the commotion was a sleek, energetic Border Collie named Flipper. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Let's dive into today's story. Flipper, known in the neighborhood for his boundless energy and friendly nature, was typically seen chasing squirrels or playing with the children on his block. His shiny black and white coat and piercing blue eyes made him stand out, and his joyful personality endeared him to everyone. But today, Flipper wasn't his usual playful self. Instead, he was stationed firmly in front of the garage at the old Thompson residence, barking relentlessly as if trying to communicate something urgent. The Thompson house had been a quiet fixture in Cedar Hollow ever since its elderly owner, Mr. James Thompson, passed away 6 months prior. The property had been left to his son, Kevin, who had yet to decide what to do with it. For now, the house stood vacant, its once vibrant garden overgrown and the garage locked tight. Flipper's owner, Megan, had initially dismissed his barking as one of his usual antics, thinking he'd found a squirrel or a stray cat to pester. But when the barking continued for hours, Megan grew concerned. She stepped outside, her auburn hair pulled into a messy bun, and called out to him. "Flipper, what's gotten into you? Come here, boy!" she yelled, her voice cutting through the morning air. But Flipper didn't budge. His barks turned into urgent whines, and he pawed at the garage door, glancing back at Megan as if pleading for her to understand. Megan frowned and walked over, her sneakers crunching against the graveled driveway. "What's going on, boy?" she asked, crouching down beside him. She placed a hand on his head, feeling his body quiver with nervous energy. Flipper responded by barking again, his nose pointing toward the garage door. Megan tried to open it, but the door was locked tight. She jiggled the handle a few more times, but it wouldn't budge. Just then, their neighbor, Mrs. Langley, approached, clutching her morning paper. The elderly woman adjusted her glasses as she looked at Flipper. "That dog's been at it all morning," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "He's never like this. Something must be wrong." Megan nodded, her unease growing. "I don't know what's gotten into him, but he won't leave this garage. It's like he's trying to tell us something." "Did you try calling someone? Maybe animal control?" Mrs. Langley suggested. Megan hesitated. She didn't want to overreact, but Flipper's behavior was out of character. She decided to call Kevin Thompson, who still held the keys to the property. Megan pulled out her phone and quickly dialed his number, explaining the situation. Kevin arrived 20 minutes later, his SUV pulling into the driveway. He stepped out, looking puzzled but intrigued. A tall man in his early 40s, Kevin had been a regular visitor to the neighborhood before his father's passing, but his appearances had dwindled since. "Flipper, huh?" Kevin said, scratching his head as he approached. "What's gotten into you, buddy?" Flipper barked in response, his paws tapping against the ground anxiously. Megan explained the morning's events, and Kevin nodded thoughtfully. "Well, let's see what's behind the mystery," he said, pulling out a set of keys. With a turn of the lock and a creak, The garage door began to rise. The smell of dust and damp air wafted out, and the dimly lit interior came into view. Boxes were stacked haphazardly along the walls, and an old workbench stood against the back. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but Flipper darted inside, his barks echoing in the confined space. He stopped in front of an old tarp-covered object and began pawing at it, his bark intensifying. Kevin and Megan exchanged a glance before stepping closer. Kevin grabbed the edge of the tarp and yanked it off, revealing an old rusted chest. It looked like something out of a pirate movie, its iron edges corroded with time and its lock covered in dust. "What on earth is this?" Megan asked, her voice tinged with awe. Kevin knelt beside the chest, brushing off the grime. "I have no idea. This wasn't here the last time I checked the garage." The lock was old, but surprisingly intact. Kevin fiddled with it, but it wouldn't budge. Flipper sat beside him, his tail wagging as if urging him to continue. "This is strange," Kevin muttered. "Let me grab some tools from my car." As Kevin stepped outside, Megan stared at the chest, her curiosity mounting. Flipper lay down beside it, his blue eyes fixed on her as if to say, "Don't worry, I've got this covered." Kevin returned with a set of tools and began working on the lock. After several minutes of effort, there was a loud click, and the lock fell away. He hesitated before lifting the lid, his hands trembling slightly. Inside was a collection of items that immediately drew their attention. A stack of faded letters tied with a ribbon, a small leather-bound diary, and a series of old photographs were carefully arranged. There was also a folded piece of cloth that, when unfurled, revealed a tattered military uniform. Megan gasped. "Kevin, this must have belonged to your father." Kevin nodded, his expression a mix of surprise and reverence. "I didn't know he kept these things. He never talked much about his time in the service." But Flipper's attention wasn't on the letters or the uniform. He sniffed around the chest's interior, his nose brushing against a false bottom. He barked twice, pawing insistently. Kevin reached down and tapped the bottom of the chest. It sounded hollow. "There's something else here." Carefully, he pried the false bottom open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small metal box, locked and seemingly untouched for decades. What could be in there? Megan wondered aloud. Kevin's hands shook as he picked up the box. "I guess we're about to find out." Kevin carefully carried the small metal box out of the garage, his mind racing with possibilities. Flipper followed closely, his tail wagging, but his demeanor serious, as though he knew something significant was unfolding. Megan and Mrs. Langley watched with bated breath as Kevin set the box on a nearby workbench and examined it. The box was about the size of a shoebox, its edges rusted but still sturdy. The lock was old, much like the one on the larger chest, but it seemed slightly more intricate. "I'm going to need something sharper to get this open," Kevin said, heading toward his car again. As he rummaged for tools, Megan crouched beside Flipper, running her hand through his soft fur. "You're amazing, boy," she whispered. "How did you know this was here?" Flipper responded with a low whine, leaning into her touch, his bright blue eyes still fixed on the box. Megan couldn't shake the feeling that Flipper's instincts went beyond those of a typical dog. Kevin returned moments later with a screwdriver and a hammer. He worked meticulously, prying at the lock without damaging the box itself. After several tense minutes, there was a sharp snap, and the lock gave way. The lid creaked open, revealing its contents. Inside, neatly arranged, was a collection of documents, some stamped with official military seals, others handwritten. There were medals carefully wrapped in cloth, their metallic sheen dulled by time. But what caught Kevin's attention was a sealed envelope with "To my son Kevin" written in bold, precise handwriting. Megan and Mrs. Langley exchanged glances, their curiosity mirroring Kevin's. As he picked up the envelope, his fingers trembling, he carefully tore it open, revealing a neatly folded letter inside. As he unfolded it, his father's familiar handwriting stared back at him. Kevin began to read aloud. "My dearest Kevin, if you're reading this, then fate has brought you to something I've kept hidden for many years. I always intended to share this with you, but life has a way of moving faster than we expect. This chest holds pieces of my life that I rarely spoke about. My time in the service was filled with moments of both honor and hardship. Among these documents, you'll find records of a mission I was part of, one that changed my life forever. During this mission, I made a promise to a fellow soldier, one I've carried with me ever since. He entrusted me with something precious, an heirloom that belonged to his family, something he hoped would be returned if he didn't make it home. For years, I searched for his family, but never found them. If you're able, I hope you'll complete the task. I couldn't. Inside this box is everything you'll need to find them. It's a legacy that deserves to be honored. Always with love, Dad." Kevin's voice faltered as he finished the letter, his eyes brimming with tears. He sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. Megan reached out and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "What do you think it is?" she asked softly, gesturing toward the rest of the box's contents. Kevin took a deep breath and reached back into the box. Beneath the documents was a small velvet pouch, its drawstring frayed with age. He opened it cautiously, tipping its contents into his palm. Out tumbled a delicate gold locket, intricately engraved with a family crest and initials. E.J. Megan gasped. "That must be the heirloom your father mentioned." Kevin nodded, his mind spinning with questions. Who was this soldier? Where was his family now? And how could he honor his father's final request? Flipper, still sitting attentively beside the workbench, gave a soft bark, breaking the silence. Kevin looked down at him and managed a small smile. "Looks like you were onto something big, buddy." Mrs. Langley, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "You know, there's an archivist at the local historical society who specializes in military records. She might be able to help you trace the family." Kevin considered this. That's a good idea. If there are any records to be found, they'd probably be at the Historical Society. He gently placed the locket and documents back into the box, then turned to Megan. "Would you come with me? I could use the support." "Of course," Megan said without hesitation, "and I think Flipper should come too. He's the one who found all of this." Kevin chuckled, glancing at the dog. "You're right. He deserves to see this through." The next morning, Kevin, Megan, and Flipper headed to the local historical society. Flipper sat in the back seat, his head out the window, the wind ruffling his caramel fur. Kevin couldn't help but glance at him in the rearview mirror. a newfound admiration for the dog's instincts swirling in his thoughts. "Do you think we'll find anything today?" Megan asked, breaking the silence. "I hope so," Kevin replied. "If this heirloom really belonged to someone my father wanted to honor, then we owe it to him to see this through." When they arrived at the Historical Society, they were greeted by a warm, middle-aged woman named Evelyn Carter, the archivist Mrs. Langley had mentioned. Evelyn's keen eyes lit up when Kevin showed her the documents and the gold locket. "This is fascinating," Evelyn said, carefully examining the materials. "The military records here provide a starting point. Let's see. This mission your father mentioned, it looks like it was part of a reconnaissance operation during the Korean War." Evelyn walked to her desk, where a large computer sat humming. She began typing furiously, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she cross-referenced databases. Kevin and Megan waited in silence, Flipper lying patiently at their feet. "Ah, here we go," Evelyn said after a few minutes. "The initials on the locket EJ match a soldier named Edward Jameson. He was part of your father's unit. It says here he was killed in action during the mission your father mentioned." Kevin's heart sank. "He didn't make it home." Evelyn nodded solemnly. "It seems so, but there's more. According to this, Edward Jameson had a wife and a young daughter at the time of his death. They lived in Illinois. Do you think they're still there?" Megan asked. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. "It's possible. Let me check one more thing." After a few more moments of searching, Evelyn found a recent address linked to Edward Jameson's daughter, now an adult. "It looks like she still lives in Illinois," Evelyn said, jotting down the address. "If you want to return this locket, this might be your best chance." Kevin stared at the address, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. "I have to go. I need to deliver this to her." Megan placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "We'll go with you." Kevin smiled, grateful for her support, and as if understanding the gravity of the moment, Flipper let out a soft bark, his tail wagging. The road trip to Illinois was filled with anticipation. Kevin and Megan took turns driving, with Flipper happily stretched out in the back seat. Along the way, they discussed how to approach Edward Jameson's daughter and what to say about the locket. When they finally arrived at the modest suburban home listed in Evelyn's records, Kevin's heart pounded. He parked the car, took a deep breath, and retrieved the small metal box containing the locket and documents. Flipper stayed close as Kevin and Megan approached the front door. Kevin knocked, the sound echoing in the quiet neighborhood. After a moment, the door opened to reveal a kind-faced woman in her 60s. Her gray hair was tied back in a loose bun, and her warm brown eyes carried a hint of curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Hi," Kevin began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "My name is Kevin Langley. My father served with your father, Edward Jameson, during the Korean War. I believe this belongs to your family." Kevin held out the box, and the woman's expression shifted from curiosity to astonishment. She opened the lid and gasped as her eyes landed on the gold locket. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, her fingers brushing over the initials. This was my father's," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "He gave it to my mother before he left for the war. We thought it was lost forever." Kevin nodded. My father promised your father he'd return it to your family, but he never got the chance. When we found this box, I knew I had to fulfill that promise." The woman's tears spilled over, and she clutched the locket to her chest. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't know what this means to me. It's like having a piece of my father back." As Kevin explained the story of how Flipper had led them to the hidden chest, the woman smiled through her tears. She crouched down to pet the dog, who wagged his tail enthusiastically. "You're a special one, aren't you?" she said, her voice filled with gratitude. The visit turned into a heartfelt exchange of stories. The woman, whose name was Margaret, shared memories of her father, while Kevin recounted tales of his own father's kindness and dedication. Megan listened intently, and Flipper lay contentedly at their feet, his presence a comforting constant. Before they left, Margaret hugged Kevin tightly. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have again," she said. "Thank you." As they drove back home, Kevin felt a profound sense of closure. His father's promise had been kept, and he had gained something invaluable in the process, a deeper understanding of the man his father had been. Back in Riverside, life returned to a quiet rhythm, but Kevin knew he would never forget the journey they had taken. Flipper, who had once been a stray, now held a permanent place in Kevin's heart and home. The dog's instincts and loyalty had set everything in motion, and Kevin couldn't imagine life without him. One evening, as Kevin sat on the porch with Flipper at his side, he reflected on the events of the past weeks. The garage that had once been just a dusty storage space was now a symbol of his father's legacy and of the loyal dog who had unearthed it. Kevin looked down at Flipper and scratched behind his ears. "You're not just a dog," he said softly. "You're family." Flipper wagged his tail, his bright blue eyes shining with understanding.